Okay, so it's showtime. Welcome, everyone. I see that people are already, hey, Bill from Boston, already typing on the chat. So if everyone want to introduce themselves, you're all welcome. Welcome, everyone from the Growth Hackers community. That's our new AMA. So it's been a while since we have done this, but due to members' requests, we are fully back. So I just want to also thank the more than 400 people who signed up for today's AMA. We have got more than 50 questions, if I'm not mistaken. And since it would be nearly impossible to go through them all in a 1 hour session, we have select the most frequent ones, the most upvoted ones for today's session. So, and feel free to also type some questions on the chat. We will make sure that we reserve some time at the end of the AMA to go through them. Today, I want to welcome Gaurav Vohra. He's the one of the founding members of the Superhuman app, the super fast email experience built for high performance teams. He's the head of growth. He built and led the initial go-to-market team, growing from revenue from zero to more than 10 millions. Since 2021, he's led the data science team and the analytics team. Vora has also advised startups like Readwise, Start Playing Games, Kubi, and Waldo. So I guess we all have a lot to learn today. So without further ado, welcome aboard, Gaurav.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Pedro. Really excited to be here.
Awesome. We're excited to have you. So let's start with the beginning. So could you tell us a little bit more about your background and what you did before Superhuman? And also, how did you get involved with that rocket ship of a project?
Yeah, awesome. Happy to share. I think it's maybe a little bit unfashionable in tech, but my background actually began in management consulting. I spent around 5 years or so out of university in consulting. That's not strictly true as the first step of my career. I did actually join a tech company as an intern between my freshman and sophomore year. That tech company was focused on a combination of productivity, SQL, and my role was kind of in the go-to-market slash product management space. So growth, basically. It was a really great opportunity when I was incredibly early in my career to sort of be exposed to all of these ideas that, as a growth professional are incredibly important. Everything from data to go-to-market to product to productivity. Though I wanted to learn a little bit more about the commercials of business and how strategy works, which is why I then spent 5 years in management consulting. So I worked for a firm called Oliver Wyman in London for about 4 years, and then out of our San Francisco office for another year. And during that time, actually, sort of transitioned away from more of the strategy and management consulting side, more into technical consulting and like actually building software for our clients. What I noticed was that most of the impact wasn't in just the strategic recommendation, it was actually getting hands-on and building the software. And that then led to much more of an interest in growth, because the kinds of things that management consultants do is all the kinds of things that growth professionals do. It's all, decision science around pricing or monetization or how to go to market better, or, your marketing approach. And we would actually build the products that our customers would use to make those decisions better. So it was kind of like B2B SaaS in and of itself. With a little bit of that under my belt and a couple of years of training and development there, I realized I really wanted to get closer to tech. And so that was part of the move to San Francisco. And fairly serendipitously, Superhuman was sort of getting off the ground at around the time I moved to San Francisco. And so, I got involved as soon as it was getting off the ground. It's been an incredible journey since then. I'm going back to 2015 up until now. And I've had the pleasure of wearing many hats with Superhuman, which I'm happy to share more about. But it's been a wonderful journey, kind of doing absolutely everything there is to do that you could consider defining as growth, from when we were just a couple of people in a room with some big dreams and no lines of code written, all the way through to now, where as a company, we are just north of 110 people, rapidly growing. The vision very much has been brought to life, and there's many, many people who use and love the product. And there's so much more that we have yet to even do. And I remain excited about that.
That's awesome. It seems like the unfashionable it's becoming more fashionable nowadays. So like the dropouts are being
Maybe.
replaced, but the consulting ones, the consulting background is becoming more common as we go. So yeah, and it's awesome to hear. Like you mentioned that you first got involved with that in 2015, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So we are 9 years almost on the go.
9 years and
And
counting.
yeah, and the reason why I'm asking that is because like growth usually evolves, like growth really adapts to the company maturity and their growth stage. So I'm guessing that has changed a lot over the course of the last 9 years or so. Can you tell us a little bit of how that went? Like since the first
Mhm.
format or the first stage of growth up until now, how that looks like.
Yeah, I'm curious actually, are you referring to sort of my take on the community and how the profession has evolved, or more like within the company?
Within the company would be great, like
Yeah.
because I guess like that article about the first round capital
Mhm.
article about the superhuman product market fit stage. You were probably involved with that, and there's a lot of growth on that, but growth directed to actually finding product market fit. And now
Yeah.
it's a totally different stage. So I was just wondering the difference of how growth actually looks like from your
Yes.
perspective to that up until nowadays.
Yes. So the early years of Superhuman, and I would encourage this to be the mindset of any early growth hire at a like really young startup. The early years of Superhuman, growth was defined as what is necessary in order for the company to grow. It was just like the most broad and generic question, which is arguably everything, right? So it's like, well, we need a product. So what did I do? Well, I spent, at least 6 months actually hands-on building features in the product. If anyone here has used Superhuman, if you hit question mark and a little shortcuts tray slides out on the right-hand side, teaches you all the shortcuts you can search and filter. That was a feature that I built. It was apparent to me that we needed ways for users to learn shortcuts in the product itself. And of course, all of our engineers were far too busy building the real features that actually needed to exist inside of
Yeah.
Superhuman. So you had a tinkerer like me on the side, kind of building these relatively low complexity things that were still nonetheless incredibly important for new user activation and retention. So that was necessary in order for us to grow. Like we needed a product that people could learn. There was a point in time when obviously, I'm not an engineer by training, I can do a little bit. There was a point in time when that stopped being the most high leverage thing necessary in order for us to grow. And what started becoming important was actually having a decent throughput of customers and having all of the steps in the go-to-market journey. Now, bear in mind at this time we were still a team of 7 or 8, right? And I was the only go-to-market or like customer-facing person. So this entailed being a sort of hands-on individual contributor, doing everything from manually going around San Francisco onboarding customers to handling all of their emails afterwards as our single person support team, to then figuring out what we do with marketing and how we manage our now famous, infamous waitlist situation. So really kind of owning the full end-to-end funnel, but just kind of piping enough customers through the system so that we had meaningful learnings that we could then feed back to our product and engineering side of things. So that was growth, for the next year or so, kind of doing that sort of thing on rinse and repeat. Eventually, those motions reached a level where clearly I didn't have enough time to do all of them, right? Like I couldn't onboard all the customers and respond to all the emails and so on. So the next stage of growth was starting to scale out those teams and get kind of sub teams in place.
Mhm.
So that involved building out what we now call our delight team, our support team, building our onboarding team, the famous sort of one-on-one concierge onboarding team, and then building our marketing team. So I actually scaled all three of those functions to a certain level, varying sizes. All in all, go-to-market ended up being around 35 people or so with different sub-teams that I was leading. And that was defined as growth, right? Very
Got it.
uncommon, in a larger company for growth to be responsible for your customer-facing go-to-market teams. Like
Yeah.
usually those roll up into a head of customer or maybe a head of experience, a head of success, that kind of a leader. But early on, those were the things necessary for us to grow. So they kind of were defined as growth. I skipped over a slight step, and this is, I think, this is an example of how growth is defined as literally whatever it takes to grow. I also spent 9 months just hiring engineers because
Okay.
that's what we needed in order to grow. Like, we didn't have enough engineers. So I applied all of my funnel optimization brain to the funnel problem of candidates and how you get someone from, a cold outreach all the way through to working at your company. And, was able to double our engineering team in 9 months and then get back to working on actual growth.
Yeah.
So that's probably the first 3 or 4 years or so, is kind of getting go-to-market kind of spun up. The next couple of years was a case of leaning more into what I think larger companies see as typical growth, which usually falls into one of two camps, or often both, which is growth marketing and growth product. Growth marketing being more top of funnel, to do with your channel strategy, your channel mix, how you optimize your funnel, get people from hearing about your company all the way through to logging into the product. Usually that's where growth marketing kind of stops. Sometimes it goes a little bit beyond that into your virality and your other kind of hooks. But that was a big focus of mine for a good couple of years, alongside building out our, as you mentioned, analytics and data science team. And then growth product is more in the app itself. Like, what are all the flows necessary in order to activate, engage, retain, monetize users, and then of course turn them into champions who are then more viral and sharing the product with others. And so that's actually been the last few years, is focusing more on the growth product side of things, never too far or distant from marketing and growth marketing in particular. And frankly, never too far away from the core product either, because at the end of the day, it's all one and the same system. So that's a little whirlwind tour of the journey.
Yeah, I love that. And it feels to me like the company does have a strong culture of embracing the validation of hypotheses, of testing things out, of embracing the unknown, all those like little pieces that actually build the growth mindset that comes with it, which is normally, from what I hear from the community, it's usually the biggest bottleneck that they face. Like, I know everything about growth, but I struggle to actually explain that to my boss or my C-level or so on. And it feels like Superhuman was born with it. Am I getting that right?
So there's a couple of thoughts there. Definitely born with it from the perspective of coming at problems from first principles and making sure that we test our way into assumptions and validate hypotheses as we go. So that's always been there from the start. Something that Superhuman has always done a little bit differently to other companies, and perhaps maybe runs counter to typical growth culture, is we've actually spent a lot longer willing into success strategies and efforts that I think many other companies would either never try whatsoever, or try for a little bit and then give up if the early data wasn't looking promising. And that idea of willing something into success based on your intuition or your strategic belief, I think, is something that's a little underrepresented in the community overall. There's a lot that's written about experimentation and fail fast and rapid, prototyping, MVPs, kind of fail, throw stuff against the wall and see what sticks, like the sort of typical Facebook culture of growth experimentation.
Yeah.
So much is written about that I think it actually crowds out the other end of that spectrum, which is a little bit more visionary and philosophical of, if these things are all true, then it is inexorable that this conclusion will also be true. We just have to make that the case, right? And that's how more iconic brands and products are built, in my view. That's how companies and products like Apple and Tesla are built, with a very clear vision that might take a very long time to reach, but you have to try at it for many months or even years and will it into success. Now, that's actually in tension with a typical growth mindset. So there does have to be a point in time where you kind of, cut your losses and don't throw good money after bad, and change your approach. But I think it's important to sort of recognize the balance there, and also accept that, you can be a growth professional living in a very philosophical or, first principles driven world.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that. And yeah, if you take, I drifted a little bit out of like the community questions, because just out of my personal curiosity, but I'm going to go back to that right away.
Yeah, no worries.
Right. So I guess, like, maybe due to that, like the go-to-market and the product market fit article that became so successful, we got a lot of questions about the go-to-market strategy and also the product market fit. So we're gonna go back to that and ask you, how did you initially plan the go-to-market when you were like on the early days of Superhuman, the Superhuman growth team, and what was like your thought process and mindset during that process?
Yeah, definitely. I remember reading an article super early on, around 2015, that talked about how you should approach growth at a really small company. And it had this piece of advice, which is that you should optimize your funnel from the bottom upwards. There's a number of reasons why that's really important. First, I'll explain what it means, and then I'll get into those reasons. What it means is if you take your funnel all the way through from, let's say, acquisition through to activation of new users, through to engagement of those users, maybe retention, maybe then monetization, and maybe there's virality or sort of sharing of the product at the very end of that chain. It's better to focus on the last step of that and to get that really good, because if you don't do that, then you're essentially going to spend all this effort higher up in the funnel, but be throwing water into a leaky bucket. There could have been things that you would do in the bottom of that journey that would make all of your efforts higher up the funnel have more ultimate impact in the long run. So there's a very clear reason around, the water in a leaky bucket analogy. There's another less obvious reason that's also true, which is that it takes a lot longer for experiments to run their course if they have to run all the way through from acquisition down to retained money. Let's say there's like a 60-day sales cycle and then 90 days of evaluation. You could be half a year or so before you've even understood the impact of your acquisition experiment. Whereas if you make a change on your retention, you might be able to see the impact within a day or two. And so your learning cycles are a lot faster. And so you get better faster at what you're doing, such that when you get to your acquisition experiments, you're already a well-oiled machine. So anyway, that was the overarching philosophy of what I was doing. It was optimizing the funnel from the bottom upwards. And that's why, like I mentioned, I started with going, really building the product, because that's the deepest part of the funnel, but then going around San Francisco and onboarding folks in person, and then sticking with those customers and really making sure that they retained, like literally watching their retention day by day, week by week, and engaging with them when they dropped off, but also engaging with them when they were highly engaged, and figuring out what was it that they loved and what was it that was pulling them away, and using that to drive the product. This is at a time when every growth professional you might talk to would suggest that growth is all about acquisition, marketing, scale and reach, right? Like our competitors at that time were actually acquiring tens of thousands of customers, and we could see the number of engagements they were getting on Twitter and the kinds of volumes that they were talking about. And it very much felt like we were running counter to the grain to only be working with 10, maybe 100, maybe 200 customers when they were working with 10,000 or 20,000. But I would expect that they actually churned maybe 90% of those customers within 3 months, whereas we were working on maintaining and growing a very healthy retention curve instead, knowing that we could always reach those same people in the future as long as we could retain them better. So that was kind of the approach that I took to the growth funnel. And then, as I mentioned, as the work kind of outpaced my own ability, there's a huge process of beginning to hire and scale up for those functions.
I love that. Because like most of the growth studies and successful cases that we read about, it's all about acquisition. But if you take for the word, like Chanel is always faced, like normally in 90% of the cases, like if you focus on activation or retention, there's probably a bigger opportunity for you in there that is going to take a lot of less effort than simply adding more leads on the top of your funnel. So really, really like that. And I honestly haven't thought about it as like the feedback cycle. You're testing on the top of the funnel, it's a lot longer than it would be on the bottom of the funnel. And
absolutely,
times is pretty scarce on those days. Not that it's not right now, but even worse back in the days.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think what, it's understandable where this mentality comes from. There are many breakout startups that are breakouts specifically because they crack acquisition at a level that is unheard of, right? They will get not just hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of users in a couple of months. And, then they sort of break orbit, reach the stratosphere, and everyone knows their name overnight. The question is, how well do those customers retain? Even if you're in the millions, if you have, a 90% loss within 3 months, that's not looking very healthy. At the end of those 3 months, you still have a huge amount of operating expense, usually, to support that number of customers. There's probably more bugs and issues rolling in than you can possibly deal with. You've lost a lot of brand equity with everyone who stopped using the product, and you're left with kind of a small number of customers at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Whether or not they're paying also is a question to keep your startup alive. So I think there's a lot of seductive appeal in those kinds of stories. Everyone wants to be that startup, but you have to make sure it's healthy revenue and healthy engagement.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah. And there are like two other questions, follow-up questions that are connected with your answer. The first one, it's like, how did you get your first 1,000 customers?
Mm-hmm.
And the second one is also, so let's go with that first, and then I will follow up with the next one.
Yeah. So folks who have been following the Superhuman story might remember that we had a wait list, very famously so, and it was hundreds of thousands of people long. There were email addresses pouring in. We did grand events and stunts to kind of, get tens of thousands of more people to sign up, whether it was taking over product hunts for a day or capitalizing on when Mailbox which was acquired by Dropbox, was actually shut down by Dropbox, and kind of publishing a thought piece on the day that happened, as well as launching on new websites. So there were all these things we were doing to build demand. And yeah, as the growth person in the company, it was kind of stressful having this huge amount of demand on the one hand, but only really talking to like 20 or 30 customers on the other. It very much felt like needing to, manage the long line outside of the Apple store for literally quarters on end. But kind of figured out the routine. The first 1,000 customers was a combination of friends and family, word of mouth, referral, beginning to let people off said wait list, but really selectively and choosily picking customers who are the highest expectation customer. So when I say highest expectation customer, of those, let's say 100,000 people on the wait list, starting with the friendly ones, the ones that we actually knew, and further sub-selecting for founders, VCs, people who really have a big email problem and whose expectations are really high. Because what that did was it set the bar incredibly high for us to begin with. We weren't starting with early adopters and people who didn't really have an email problem but were super excited about the next email tool. We were starting with people who had a deep problem. And if we could retain those people and have those people love Superhuman, then all the other personas would be significantly easier to acquire and retain. And so, it was a case of manually onboarding those customers. And not only did we manually onboard the first 1,000 customers, we manually onboarded many tens of thousands of customers. We scaled that team to 25 people, and each person was doing between 30 and 40 onboardings a week. So, that was a process and a go-to-market we scaled incredibly far. But the first 1,000 in particular, very high bandwidth, 30 to 60-minute conversations to make sure they really got the product and also knew who we were and understood the brand and what we stood for. But also we really understood them. Every single conversation yielded 2 to 3 bugs that we needed to fix and probably 3 to 5 feature requests that would help us prioritize what to work on next. And so it was a mutually incredibly beneficial amount of time being spent there.
Really nice to hear. And also, like on those early days when you guys were getting that first 1,000 customers, it became like quite famous that Superhuman was using the Chainalysis score, the PMF survey. For those who are watching us and are not familiar with that, Chan actually tried to measure product market fit, or trying to make it as measurable as possible by asking customers how unsatisfied or how dissatisfied they would be if they could no longer use the product. So, and Superhuman was one of the companies that actually used that and became like quite famous on the growth environment by using it. So do you guys still use that as you ship new features, or was that a new one-time thing? And do you have anything to add on when you guys were actually running those surveys with the initial set of customers?
Yeah, sure. So the story behind that is actually an interesting one. There was a morning when I was working on the problem of, we don't have enough feedback coming in. We don't know if we're doing well or not. And it kind of manifests in 2 ways. One, we didn't have enough real customer feedback. So like a satisfaction survey after 14 days of using the product. We sort of
Mhm.
had to remember to manually reach out to customers to find out how they were getting on. And that was annoying me. So I wanted to come up with a survey we could send automatically that got feedback. And obviously it would have an NPS question. But that's when, between Rahul, our CEO, and I, we were looking at the Sean Ellis questions and also saying, well, we should include those. And so, I came up with a simple type form that has the questions, and that was triggered. I won't go into all the logic and details of how it's triggered, but you have to be an activated customer to get the survey in the first place. That's a filter for whether you've actually grokked the product. So we set that up. There was actually another survey I set up, which was a feedback loop before you're even onboarded, what we called the pre-onboarding survey. That helped us figure out like who the prospect was, more on a marketing level, and what their needs were. Is this a person who needs Outlook support in Android? If so, we're many years away from being able to support them. So we can politely tell them we just don't have that product for them, and kind of take note of their needs and then circle back to them when we're ready in the future. On the other hand, if someone is just looking for a desktop Mac experience right now, then we can support them. That's an easy way to make sure you're talking to the right customers to begin with, and then surveying them, knowing that they've been, there's some amount of fit with the product you've been able to build.
They were answering that when they entered the waiting list, or was
Yeah,
that?
so the way that worked was you put your email address in the website, and then you were asked to fill a survey, and we had some logic in Zapier that was looking at the survey responses. And if certain conditions were met, it was like, okay, now you can go book an onboarding. If certain conditions were failed, we would send a super polite email that was like, we're really sorry, we just don't have an Android app yet. We don't think this is going to be worth your time or your $30 a month right now. So we've taken note of your need, and we will circle back when we're ready. And of course, customers always have the opportunity to respond and say, I don't need an Android app, just let me in anyway. I'll just use it on desktop. There was always that back and forth possibility.
Yeah.
So that was the pre-onboarding survey, and then there was the satisfaction survey. And we set up the pre-onboarding survey and paid really close attention to it. Like literally, it was driving our actions every single day on the growth team. We set up the satisfaction survey, and our delight team would respond to each one. If you got a low NPS, or if you got some solid feedback through the survey, that's the same as getting a ticket, right? Like a support email. So that merits an immediate response. But in terms of actually analyzing the Sean Ellis PMF data, it was nearly a year, maybe two, before Rahul sat down and was like, wow, we have enough data now that we can do something with it. And that was kind of the genesis of writing the product market fit article, to see exactly how we benchmarked against the 40% product market fit. We were, of course, tracking our product market fit, on a monthly basis and kind of looking at that percent. It started around 20%, kind of moved up to 30, then moved up to 40, indicating increasing product market fit over time. But in terms of actually coalescing all of the thinking, that took almost a year or two of gathering data. Yeah. Now, implied in my story is how these surveys were just on in the background and continue to be on. The pre-onboarding survey is gone, but the satisfaction survey is still there. So yeah, we still measure product market fit every single week. Like we know how disappointed our new customers would be if Superhuman were to disappear. And we use product market fit to measure the success of certain sub-features or product lines. So for example, we're working on Superhuman for salespeople. There is a product market fit score for specifically Superhuman for sales with features that are targeted and geared towards account executives and managers. We also measure product market fit at a specific feature level. So for an AI feature, we can ask users, how disappointed would you be if you couldn't use this feature, to get a sense of how much product market fit that feature has within the overall ecosystem. And I think it's a very powerful tool. It allows for a common language across product managers and growth professionals on how sticky and how relevant the thing you've built actually is.
Yeah, I love that, because sometimes people think that it's a one-time thing. You've got your product market fit, you're ready to go, like that phase is over, but it's more like a moving target as your product evolves, right?
As your product evolves and as the market evolves is the other key thing, right? You can fall out of product market fit just with some market change that is happening alongside your product's development. And yes, like you said, like product market fit is a thing you fall in and out of. You have to keep working at it. It's like a good relationship. It's not a once and done.
Love this analogy. It's a moving target. Perfect. So Vora, we got one from Lucas that is asking, and I'm guessing that changed a lot as the growth team also changed
Yeah.
in the different company stage. But what would you say that is the most important KPI when we're looking from a growth perspective?
Yeah, so this really depends on the stage of the business. We spent a lot of time talking about product market fit, and I would say that that is the most important KPI early on. Like when you're building the product, you need to get to product market fit. There's nothing else that matters. And whether it's Paul Graham or Mark Andreessen, like there are lots of essays and thought pieces on that go into more detail on why that's the case. Let's say that you've reached initial product market fit. Now, you shouldn't stop focusing on that, but you need to add metrics to your roster of metrics you care about. I think the next stage is the hardest part for most companies because it is the ugly trifecta of monetization, usage, and engagement of your product that then ultimately leads to retention. Retention both of dollars and retention of usage. And this is hard, right? This is like trying to solve for 2 or 3 things all at once. Some companies raise venture capital and just skip the monetization part and only focus on usage and retention of users at this point, and they just rely on venture capital to get to the point where they can then solve monetization. That's one way out of it. But if you're not reliant on venture capital, or if you don't have a lot of runway, even if you have some funding, you kind of have to solve the monetization part. And you can't really solve the monetization part unless you have real users using the product and sticking around. So I think this is genuinely the hardest part of the startup journey overall. It's actually incidentally where I spend a lot of my advisor time, because usually companies that have built incredible products come from product founders who know what the problem is and can really build something amazing, but then they struggle with this mushy kind of moment of, oh my gosh, I need to charge money, but then keep users around and keep them happy. Once you figure that out, once you have a product that engages, retains, and monetizes, then assuming that you are B2B SaaS, well, not even SaaS, but assuming that you're B2B, what really matters at that point is focusing on your net revenue retention. So the KPI you should focus on is basically expansion of dollars minus churn of dollars for any given time period. And can you get that to something over 100%? Can you get to the point where your cohorts grow over time? That's just crucial if you're selling to teams. If you are B2C and you don't have a selling to teams motion, there's still the possibility of growing dollars within a given subscriber, but the amount of spend an individual consumer will put towards your product is usually capped. So then usually your KPI becomes acquisition. Assuming you have some level of retention, let's say 50 to 70% retained after a year would be excellent. Then you just need to acquire like crazy and try and outpace your churn. At a certain point, and any B2C product hits this, even Netflix and Spotify have this problem, your churn will catch up to your acquisition, and then you need to start adding new product lines. You need to start figuring out other ways of monetizing. So then your KPI goes right back to product market fit of figuring out those product lines. But depending on whether you're in that B2B or B2C world, it'll be the kind of the quality of your revenue or acquisition. And then once you've cracked revenue quality in the B2B world, then it's new logo acquisition. It's like how fast are you acquiring new teams that you're then dropping into this positive NRR situation.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I love that. And one thing that Sean usually talks a lot about is like the testing velocity and testing volume, meaning the amount of hypotheses and tests and experiments that you guys are running. Is that something that you guys track, or?
It's not something I have quantitatively tracked, in the format of experiments launched a week or that kind of thing. It's more qualitative in terms of how high is our velocity as a team? Like how rapidly can we move from idea to execution? And do we have a constant throughput of high quality releases or experiments going live? I think when a company's much bigger, let's say again, like Facebook scale, there's probably someone tracking experiment velocity in the company. But I think what's more important as a growth individual or leader is to figure out intuitively, what's the theoretical fastest we could and should be going? And are we either close to that or at least approaching that over time? That's incredibly important. The rate at which you move is, I believe, one of the most important things in growth, arguably in startups overall.
Yeah, makes tons of sense. All right, and Vora, like you're currently leading the data science team and analytics team. So I'm gonna go to Angelica question in which she asks, like, what is the best way of actually analyzing user data and getting the aha moment that can drive great insights and for great insights for change?
Yeah, so I think there's a number of ways to maybe directions to take this question, but the direction I'll take it in is how do you define your activation moment or your aha moment,
Perfect.
which is both like a qualitative, intuitive exercise, but also can be backed up with hard quantitative evidence. Qualitatively, you should have some idea of this. Like, you have no business in growth if you don't have a bunch of hypotheses as to what actually is the aha moment for a new user. Like, you should have like an immediate response. It's probably this, right? For Superhuman, it's when you hit inbox zero for the first time, or when you've cleared your first 10 emails and you start to feel that pressure lifting. Now, the quantitative side of that is you can regress a bunch of inputs on the output metric of, is the user retained 30 or 90 days later? So assuming you have enough data historically, you can say, well, let's take 10 hypotheses of things that could be the aha moment and see which of those are correlated and indeed seem to be the most causal against retention after 30 or 90 days. And there are a number of off-the-shelf tools that will help you do this these days that take care of all of the causal inference challenges that you can come across when you try and do that kind of analysis. There's all sorts of correlation and I guess multiple factors kind of all being associated with the same users, so it being hard to tease out exactly which one of those to focus on. But there are ways to kind of numerically work your way out of that. And basically you get to the point where you're like, well, this action or this set of actions is probably the most predictive. And you really want to go for something simple there. You want to say, okay, it's 10 emails have been cleared, nothing else, right? Let's not complicate it and say it's 10 emails cleared and they did Command K 3 times and they also, because at that point you don't know what you're solving for and the team's going to find it very hard to work against that. And you can call that your aha moment. The other things that you cast aside in that process can also still be tracked. They can still be things that you look at and try and make better. And there are moments deeper in the funnel that can still be really important. So maybe the first aha moment is 50 clearing emails, but then 3 weeks later, the next aha moment that your team might be working towards is when they first invite that next teammate to join them, right? That might be ultimately where your business needs to go, but it might be dependent on the first aha moment. So that's not to say you end up with just like one concept forever, but it helps you simplify the way you think about things. And the last bit that I think is incredibly important here is you have to talk to customers and actually validate if any of this stuff makes sense, right? So through user interviews, validate, okay, when did you first feel like you got Superhuman? What was it? Some people will say keyboard shortcuts, some people will say clearing actions, etc. You ideally want to be hearing customers saying the thing that you think is your aha moment without you nudging them in that direction by asking them the open-ended question.
Cool. And again, out of personal curiosity here, but how many of your initial customers you actually manually onboard those people? Because one question that I frequently get is, "Hey, I don't have many data. We don't have much customers. We don't have much reach. So,
Yeah.
up until which point is there a validated number of customers that you say, hey, we can focus on that and on that?" So, like how many of them did you guys actually onboard manually before
Also,
starting automating and coding?
I personally onboarded around 400 customers, give or take. There are people on my onboarding team who onboarded close to 3,000 customers, and there are multiple people in that camp. And across our founding team, in the hundreds. Now, like I said, we were kind of, I think, the outlier there. I think most startups probably somewhere between 50 and a couple hundred is the right number for founders and for founding individuals on the team. At which point you need to figure out if you can automate and scale, or if that's actually a core part of your motion. Like, and let's say you're B2B and like a critical part of your selling process is to do a pilot and to then do a hands-on close. Just keep that. I mean, if that's how you get a $10,000 contract in place, and that is $10,000 that is not going to churn for the next 12 months, that's really worth the several hours it will
Really
take to close if you can just rinse and repeat that. So when and how you automate, I think, is a function of your overall like check size from customers and your ability to be efficient in your pipeline. But I think somewhere in the realm of like 50 to a few hundred is around enough customer conversations that you should have built up a pretty robust patchwork of understanding
Yeah.
of what your customers care about. The
Awesome.
one thing I
Awesome.
would add here, Pedro, is that some
Yeah.
startups have the difficult challenge of really only having somewhere between 10 and 100 customers total, like the most enterprise B2B you can imagine, and they just don't have the luxury of talking to them. That is its own challenge, right? Like as a
Yeah.
growth person, honestly, I'm not sure there's space for a growth person in a company like that. It's more of a sales problem, and you need a really seasoned sales leader who thinks like a growth person or thinks enough like a growth person, but has dozens of other strategies and tactics to figure out, are we building the right thing? How do I get in front of the right people? And kind of getting that feedback cycle. But it's a much harder process to kind of do that experimentation and that learning.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I was actually watching a clip from Elon Musk yesterday in which he was mentioning like his framework for whenever he comes, regardless if it's software and hardware. And the last stop, like usually the first stop of people focus on is the automation. And for him, that's the fifth step. Fifth and last step of the process is actually automating, not before cutting everything and then adding things again and then optimizing it. The last one is actually automating. So I like the way. Yeah, cool. So I got one from Gillian, which we receive a lot. It's how do you come up with growth experiments to run? I mean, she's probably meaning ideas for experiments, and how do you currently track of all of that if you're running multiple experiments in different part of the business?
Yeah, so I'll answer the last part of that, which is running multiple experiments in different parts of the business. I really challenge whether that's something you should be doing, especially in a smaller startup. In a bigger company, of course, like different parts of the company are doing different things. But in a smaller company, it's probably the case that you should be focused in one area, maybe two. Like I mentioned, start at the bottom of your funnel and work your way upwards. But if you find yourself with an experiment on acquisition at the same time as an experiment on churn, that to me suggests the strategy is kind of nebulous. It probably is the case that you need to focus on one of those, and it's probably churn. So I would say start with a strategy question of what is most important right now. Coming up with growth experiments, we run brainstorms, ideation sessions. Those are informed by cross-functional groups. We have everyone from growth to product, marketing to analytics to engineering and design, all kind of take part in coming up with ideas and fluidly sharing those in a way that's very easy. And then tracking those, we have like a Notion page that's just like the backlog of ideas and experiments. We also study competitors. Growth is nice because you can just look at 10 competitors and get the best of breed just by looking at them. Core products are a little bit harder like that. You can't just do that. You have to have a little bit more customer research and sort of intuition about where the market's heading. But with growth, like if you're trying to think through a churn win back strategy, just go look at 10 other companies that do churn win back really well and figure out what's working. And then from that long list of ideas, right, it's a classic impact, effort, risk calculation. So where is the highest impact for the lowest effort with the least amount of risk, and stack rank like that. Then in terms of tracking, like I said, it's better if you have a series of efforts all focused in one area. And then it becomes a lot easier to track, and you don't have to worry about the hard data problem of mixed cohorts merging into other experiments. But if you have your instrumentation set up, then it's often fine to have multiple experiments running in parallel.
I love that. And I guess like we had another host in one of our past AMAs that he actually named the KPI for the growth team to be the obsession metric. So before we go into another one, we need to reach that obsession metric, the obsession objective, and then we move along to the next challenge. So all of our growth efforts are going to be focused on one part of things, and then we move along to the next one, which is kind of supports your line of thought. Cool. Yeah. And Gaurav, so another one, I guess like you partially already answered about prioritizing which experiments you should run. So I'm gonna go from one from Jade, which is, and you also kind of touch based on the onboarding experience and aha moment. But what is your main advice on how to build a great onboarding experience, and how did you go about building Superhumans?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would give a lot of credit here to Samuel Hulick of useronboard.com, who has for a very long time been producing teardowns and
Yes.
thought
So,
leadership on user onboarding. So I would very much recommend checking useronboard.com out. In particular, I'm just going to rep this PDF, which literally became the backbone, or one of the backbones, of how we thought about onboarding. And in it is this really important idea. It's kind of the famous Mario diagram of Super Mario of what you're selling is not the fire plant upgrade. What you're selling is the cool customer who can do cool shit, right? Which is, in Mario's case, firing fireballs. That's what you're selling. You're not selling a cool product. You're selling the upgraded version of the customer. And so you have to remember that when you're designing your onboarding, meaning you have to get your users to experience personal value as quickly as possible, and for them to realize what this product means for them in this moment. And ideally also get them to realize that they may not be fully there yet in terms of climbing the mountain of self-improvement, but that the mountain exists and that it's worth their efforts to keep going, that they can see the top of the mountain and they can also see a path to getting to the top of the mountain. And again, this is explained in the PDF. It's a really thoughtful piece of content. So that's something I encourage as a philosophical approach to designing a great onboarding. Other tactical things, I would say, focus the customer on one thing at a time. You don't want to have a multitude of things grabbing their attention. You want them to understand a new concept, achieve a win, get that under their belt, and then move on to the next thing. We've already talked about manually onboarding customers, so I won't repeat that, but I can't undersell the importance of doing that before you try and automate your onboarding. Another tactic that's incredibly important is laying out the entire journey end to end on a timeline so that you know exactly what customers are experiencing day minus 30 all the way through to day 30 and every day or even hour in between. And then the last bit is to consider the various modalities. You've got in-app, but you also have email, nudge, notification. There are different ways you can reach users in terms of your onboarding, and those channels are good for different things. And also there's sub-modalities within the product. You can have guided tours, checklists, account setup steps, demo sandboxes, tooltips, inline videos, the list goes on, right? So you should consider what is going to make the most sense. And at that point, I will also share a blog post that I had a hand in co-writing, which is sort of the product-led onboarding playbook. Not sure if I was able to post that into the chat, but we can follow up in the show notes. Which goes over a lot of those concepts, and that's a collaboration I did with a few other growth leaders, as well as Adopt Startup on some of the best advice and tactics for designing an amazing onboarding.
I love that. And as you said, we are gonna take like the links are gonna be on the show notes, so everyone who wants to dive deep into that afterwards can have access to it. And so we are approaching the last 20 minutes. So before I open up for like the audience questions, I'm gonna pick one last question from the community from Tiago, which I really love this question because we get frequently asked, and I feel like growth teams get a lot of pressure on that question, which is how can we balance the need for accelerated short-term growth and work more on the transformational evolution that require more time to bring revenue results? So how do you balance that out? Short-term from long-term experience and projects.
Yeah. So I'm not sure how controversial or not this is, but my advice is to push back on the pressure for accelerated short-term growth as much as you reasonably can, or at the very least be curious and question where it's coming from. For example, will your company literally run out of money if you do not get short-term growth? And if so, well, then you're all out of a job and you probably should figure out that problem. But is that just undue pressure coming from someone in the company or maybe an investor or a board member, but actually it is not necessary to the survival of the business? Those are questions you should be asking in a growth role. I often see founders working against growth goals that are completely unrealistic because they feel as though they need to reach a milestone by a certain point in time, some combination of board pressure and runway, and when they think they'll next actually be able to raise funds. And it leads to a bit of a death spiral in terms of the founder's ability to make progress. Often there'll be something fundamentally wrong with the go-to-market or the monetization approach. They could be charging 10 times what they're currently charging, and maybe they haven't realized that, and now they're needing to acquire 10 times as many people, which is just unrealistic. It's a very common situation that I've seen. There are other situations, but really, I think the meta point here is that growth as a function should be a partner to and really a driver of any discussions on finance, runway, fundraising, board and investor expectations. Growth should be in the room having those conversations, because the number that you're driving at the end of the day, if it's revenue, is the critical input to your company's ability to survive, cost being the other one. And if you're not in the room able to talk about those things, then there's a more fundamental problem at play. Now, let's say you are in the room on all those things and you still have the sort of pressure to have short-term accelerated growth relative to more fundamental improvements. I think what my advice would be there is, if there's something you could do to massively swing, let's say, top of funnel, even if you have a leaky bucket, but you think it's the right thing on balance because it will build your brand or get you to the next level of revenue that will give you the next 6 months to figure things out, then it might be worthwhile to just give it a swing. But be really cautious about the leaky buckets. Like, if it's a trade-off between improving retention so that you're not in that situation of losing 90% of your customers, or just acquiring tens of thousands of people, I really, really encourage working on the retention side of that as much as you can. And then as soon as you're confident that that's done, then do the other thing. But you'll be much better off by doing it in that order.
Got it. Couldn't agree more. So I'm gonna get a question from our YouTube audience. Rahul Mehta is asking, how do you think about the difference between marketing versus growth versus product? Do you view them as all of the same, or especially because a lot of companies do? So how do you look at that? Is there a clear definition separation? Is there a unit group that all works together? Cross-functional project is usually also something that is a lot to discuss, also a mountain to climb. So would love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, great question. There's a lot that's written about this. I think it's very, very high quality from folks like Andrew Chen and in the Reforge community on how you even define growth. There are a couple of different models as well. I'll give you my take on what I think works really well. These are 3 separate functions ultimately, but they are like overlapping Venn diagrams that have to be in lockstep with one another. Marketing is primarily concerned with the brand of the company, the reach of the company to people who have not yet heard about your company, and all the way through to product marketing. Marketing is responsible for how you talk about your product to your existing customers and how you might even reactivate some of your lapsed customers. So marketing, really straddles the full funnel, but I'd say maybe 70% of the focus is on people who are not yet customers. And there's all sorts of stuff that falls into that. Some of that's very growthy, right? That's where growth marketing is a function or is a thing that can exist. Now, should your growth marketer be on the marketing team or the growth team? It doesn't really matter as long as they're working together. Product, I'll say core product, is building the actual thing your customers use. It's figuring out what is the problem experienced by your customer or by the market and solving that problem really well. That is strictly a problem-solving role, figuring out what is going to get users to use the product, and then thinking about, obviously, core product should be thinking about things like retention and monetization as well. And again, the core product team has to be in lockstep with growth, because if they're not, then you're probably going to be less than half as effective. Now, growth sits in the middle. Growth is like the circle and the Venn diagram that is overlapping with core product, overlapping with marketing. If you don't know what's on the core product and marketing roadmap, you really need to figure that out and make sure that you're doing things that are complementary. But growth focuses on the more quantitative elements of figuring out how to tune and optimize all aspects of that journey. And it could be something that's very core, like activation is incredibly core. It's all about the core value proposition, but you're working on getting that number from 20% to 40%. Or it could be something that's more dollars and cents. It could be, retention of dollars, and you're doing an experiment on whether you charge annually or monthly or what have you. Or it could be very marketing focused. You could be a growth professional figuring out how do you get referrals from 1 referral per customer to 5 referrals per customer. That's kind of a marketing challenge, but as a growth professional, you're in the product with engineering, design, analytics, and building stuff. So I think of them as 3 teams that need to be side by side, overlapping, focused in the same direction strategically, but leveraging different skill sets and I guess specialties to move the needle.
Yeah, I agree with every line. Right, so we have 4 minutes left. So I'm gonna move to the last question from the YouTube audience. This one was from Sophia Huang. So what if you're talking about a big company with a huge experimentation backlog, coordination, and launching checklists? Is there a series of checks before and post launch of an experiment that you would recommend people to go through?
I think this is the kind of thing that every company needs to own, right? Like they need to have their own documentation of what makes sense for them. I think it's very different per company and per product as well, because the risk of messing it up varies enormously based on what you're actually building. Take Superhuman, for example. We cannot risk messing up people's email, but maybe take a social network. Does it matter if there's a small glitch in loading the timeline or the feed? Some users might get a little annoyed, but probably not, right? Like there's an expectation that the contents of a feed are dynamic and can change from time to time and so on. So it really depends on your business. And I can imagine something way on the other end of the spectrum of severity, like fintech or, like handling people's money or their healthcare information or something like that, where like you have to be really buttoned up on something like an experiment. So you're going to have your own series of checks and steps. And so you need to take ownership of that and have that documentation. There are clearly some things that are important to manage in terms of your launch checklist. So often I see really incredible product and engineering teams build the thing, but then they don't have the best instrumentation in place and the data logging, right?
Yes.
And that can often set back an experiment by days or weeks because you have to relaunch with the right tracking in place. Why does that happen? I think it's because data and metrics are kind of more invisible than the actual UI of the thing. So it's very easy to validate if the UI is working as expected, but it's harder to check if the data is flowing as expected. So you really need a strong data team. You need a strong data professional, whether it's a distinct person like an analyst or a data scientist, or whether it's a very data sort of capable growth professional or engineer. Someone has to be wearing that hat. Of course, there are many, many other things that go into this, and there's probably incredible literature on it, clear hypothesis, metrics, countermetrics, a whole bunch of science around how to do a good A/B test and not full prey to some of the fallacies of A/B testing. So all of those things, probably don't have time to get into all of it, but I would encourage reading up on that literature and building the checklist around that, and making sure to not skip those steps as well, because it can really cost you in terms of time.
Gaurav, this has been awesome. I have personally learned a lot, and I bet everyone who joined us today we also did. So before we wrap things up, I also just want to invite everyone to check out, we have scheduled our next AMA with Kedo John. He's the brand new growth director at GitHub. So if you guys scan the QR code right on the screen, you should be able to sign up for that and receive notifications and also ask questions just like we did to Gaurav. Gaurav, thanks again. I had tons of fun. Appreciate you taking the time to chat with us today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Pedro. It's been a pleasure and a privilege. This was great. I see that there were many, many more questions, several dozen others we didn't get time for. And I hope one day somehow we can maybe get to those, but we can pick that one up.
Absolutely. And if people want to reach out to you or get in touch or follow you somewhere, where should they go to?
Yeah, they can find me on LinkedIn and Twitter. Just search for my name. I should come up. and you can follow me there, get in touch there, and yeah, we can pick up the conversation there.
Awesome. Thank you again, Gaurav. Thank everyone.
Awesome. Thanks. Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.
Everyone.